Chapter 12. Sleepless. It was almost midnight. Mrs. Mitchell heard her husband upstairs in bed, snoring away. But that wasn't why she couldn't sleep. Mrs. Mitchell couldn't sleep because about 10 hours ago she had stood in a schoolyard and made a promise to a 12-year-old boy. And now she had wished she hadn't. She took a sip of hot chocolate and then said out loud, "What was I thinking?" After they exchanged promises and shook on it, Ted Hammond had given his teacher a short explanation of his charity project. He told her about seeing the girl at the Anderson farmhouse, about going back and meeting her, about meeting the mom and the little brother, about learning that their dad had died in Iraq, about how they'd left Texas and how there was this sort of boyfriend who might be trying to find them, and Ted had been helping this homeless family by taking them food and supplies. Sounded simple enough. But as Ted had told her this, warning bells had begun ringing in Mrs. Mitchell's head, because she heard this story. A mom who might be mentally unbalanced was having trouble caring for two children, and all three of them were living in an abandoned house, illegally, in filthy conditions, while a boyfriend hunted for them, and he might be mentally imbalanced too. Sitting at her kitchen table, Mrs. Mitchell began imagining what people at Nebraska Health and Human Services would say about this situation, and she felt pretty sure that they would listen to Ted's story and begin to use words like neglect or endangerment. And now that Mrs. Mitchell knew Ted's story, she couldn't sit by and be a spectator, because if anything happened to those people, especially to children. And that's when Mrs. Mitchell decided that she had to do something, right away. 2 miles away in a farmhouse out along Toronto Road, someone else was wide awake at midnight. Because as Ted had told his teacher about April and her mom and brother, Mrs. Mitchell's mouth had kept smiling and her head had kept nodding, but her eyes had been cloudy. And now Ted was trying to put himself into his teacher's mind, which wasn't easy to do. But he made himself think like a detective who had to solve a mystery. He thought about all the clues, and he reviewed everything he knew about Mrs. Mitchell. And all at once, Ted got a peek into how she was probably thinking. He felt pretty sure Mrs. Mitchell would be worried about those kids, because that's what teachers do. Moms too. And Mrs. Mitchell was both a teacher and a mom. And then Ted realized that if Mrs. Mitchell was really worried about April and Artie, she'd feel like she had to do something. She'd tell somebody, like the police or the welfare police. She'd tell them, promises or no promises. He knew he had to do something. But what? Should he warn April? He could do that first thing in the morning. Except if he warned her, he'd have to tell how he broke his promise about not telling anybody. And then Ted tried to decide which would be worse. Seeing April's face when he knew he had broken his promise, or seeing April and her mom and little brother sitting in the back seat of a police car. He made his decision, then he turned over, and after another 15 minutes of tossing and turning, the Boy Scout detective paperboy finally got to sleep.